Hello everybody, my name is Tanya Hichert and I work as a futurist and in collaboration with the Center for Complex System in Transition at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And although I work in a structured way with the future, it is something that everybody does and everybody can do. And why it's important is because we're in such complex, volatile, uncertain times that there are some pretty unthinkable things that could happen. And in many ways, if we want to make the world a better place and think in different alternative ways, we should also be thinking of unthinkable futures. And the way one works with the future and futures is structured. It has an academic background, if you're that way inclined, in the discipline of future studies, but also in terms of having tools and techniques and methods. Scenario planning is the most well-known one. So if one just kind of poses the rhetorical question of why one would do this, why work with alternative futures, it's all about learning to use the future. It's about change, and it's about changing the present. And if we can use the future to change the present and do things differently today, that of course helps us change the future. So the future, of course, it doesn't exist. And our actions and our choices and how we do things and why we do things shapes the future. And our choices make some things possible tomorrow and other things not. So it becomes really important to start having a view of those things. Everything is a lot more complex, and sometimes people even find it scary. The American Army uses an acronym called VUCA: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I fall into the category of people that thinks it's inspiring and empowering, because if there's so much uncertainty and complexity, it also helps us realize sometimes that small changes and small interventions can lead to some really fundamental shifts. Futures thinking, therefore, can be a very powerful approach to unlock complex problems in an increasingly uncertain world. And it's a way of thinking about what's possible more deeply, honestly, and strategically. It's a capacity to anticipate and plan for possible futures. And the ultimate purpose of this kind of futures thinking and strategic foresight is to make better, more informed decisions in the present, not to repeat mistakes. We do need to do things differently if we're bumping into planetary boundaries, to spot challenges earlier, but also to spot opportunities earlier, and to help redesign and innovate with a view of how things can be different and more positive and better in the future. Exploring alternative futures also helps us become more aware of our own assumptions and our own cognitive biases and where we might need to change. So being human means having a view of the future, and our innate curiosity drives us to learn, explore, and experiment. And of course, we also seek to predict. But there's a little trick to this, because futures thinking is not about prediction. It's precisely about having views of multiple futures and working with those. We've always done this as human beings. Thinking back to our furthest history, where shamans and priests and mystics and traditional knowledge have thrown the bones or spoken to the Oracle of Delphi. And we still use those ways of thinking about the future. After that, in the Middle Ages, there were some of these early macro historians, and they were mostly non-Western. In the Middle East, Ibn Khaldun and a Chinese macro historian gave us interdisciplinary ways where they took all domains into consideration and realized that cyclical waves of change influenced where things were going. After that, extraction and enlightenment gave us a sort of more technocratic way of thinking of the future, and we see the early days of science fiction, H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, and that moved us into the 50s and 60s after the Second World War, where systems thinking and cybernetics became important. And right now, futures thinking helps us deal with complexity and emergence. and technology and crowdsourcing and looking for early signs of change are all part of these sort of very active ways of working with the future. Of course, what's important is why we're doing this and who we're doing this for. So future studies is an academic field that is concerned with understanding and anticipating change in society, and in order to help others conceive and pursue more desirable futures. That's a lovely definition of why one works with this thing called future studies. Learning about the future is learning about change. And Fred Pollock, who was a Dutch futurist, although he wouldn't have called himself that, after the Second World War, when Western Europe was decimated by bombs, he wrote a book called Images of the Future. And he said if you wanted to change the future, you had to have these different images of the future. Because, of course, what's important is these images live around us the whole time. We're constantly surrounded by science fiction movies or dystopian views or someone's hopes and dreams of the future. And all of these are out there. It becomes empowering and important for us as practitioners to figure out, well, which are the ones we want to work with, how and why. I'm showing you a diagram now of something called a futures cone. It's a very classical way of thinking about multiple futures. And what we see there is the blue dot is a projected future. That is business as usual. If nothing were to change, it's an extrapolation. But of course, we live in a world of such fundamental uncertainty and volatility that that's actually very unlikely to happen. That's when we start working with probable futures, and there's a huge industry there of people trying to forecast what probable futures would be like. It's a lot more empowering to start working with and thinking about what's plausible, what could happen, ultimately, what's preferable. These are the visions of different futures we would like to work with and move towards. And of course, what we talk about and what we think about starts shaping our actions. And then the outer ring you'll see is even called preposterous futures. It's those unthinkable, impossible things, but of course they happen. Just think of the Apollo 11 moon landing. If you go back early enough in history, Apollo moon landing would have been a preposterous future, yet it happened. And that is what's so useful about this way of thinking and this way of working. The next two graphs are all about scenario planning, which is the most famous and well-known futures tool. And what we see at the top half of the diagram is that we tend to, and it's because of the way we've been educated and the way we tend to think of our present and the current reality we're in and the mental map we have. We tend to think of that as a given, and that there's one single path, a probable one, into a single future. And that is where a whole lot of this forecasting thing happens. Scenarios, which is at the bottom half of the diagram, help us think completely differently. They help us think of multiple futures, that things could be completely different. And when we think of these multiple different futures and different paths, plausible and probable paths into the future, that helps us re-perceive the present. And we're able to start forming different mental maps. There's some lovely work that's being done right now by a colleague called Robin Bourgeois at grassroots community level, where people are actively working with scenarios and being empowered through building collaborative scenarios. And it's all about using local knowledge and making sense of the present, even though it is in many cases awful presence. Futures literacy helps focus on the factors, the small things that we can change around us, build scenarios about how the future could be different, and in turn helps us make different societal choices. And remember, because we're in complex times, even small changes can make huge differences. And it's through developing the capability of local agency and futures literacy that one starts making a difference and thinks differently about how to work with these huge challenges that we need to face. So up to now, we've been speaking fairly generally about how to think of the future and why it's useful. What I'd like to do now is just show a final diagram, which is called the Three Horizons Framework. And it's a wonderful way of helping us understand systemic change and the future and how it could be different. So if we look at those wavy lines, don't think of them as timelines. They're more an indication of how systems change over time. So if you look at the top left-hand corner where it says first horizon, that shows a high degree of how systems work now, a high degree of strategic fit, which is the y-axis, and as it moves through the present and into a transition phase and into the future, it becomes less and less relevant. So because the world around something that you're looking at changes, think of fossil fuels, for example, and imagine what fossil fuels would look like in the present and into the far future. And you can imagine them hanging in there, which is that first horizon, but over time declining. And sometimes these things can decline quite suddenly. And into the far future, they'd be a lot less relevant. That is what that first horizon indicates. Now imagine we're thinking about something like renewable energy. And look at the bottom left-hand corner, which is the third horizon. So renewable energy has not got as much strategic fit with the present as it may have in the future. It'll have a lot higher strategic fit if this is the way the world goes. So that third horizon is where we have pockets of the future in the present, and it goes through a transition phase, and in the future it becomes dominant. But of course there are different multiple futures out there. But stay with this example of renewable energy, because it right now is in that transition space, wanting to grow and expand and become dominant, but hitting up against something like the fossil fuel industry. So in that transition space is typically, which is the second horizon, the dotted line, that is where things are messy and turbulent, and that is where we find ourselves now. And what is really useful about this Three Horizons framework is it helps us identify in that bottom left-hand corner what are the little pockets of the future in the present. What are the small weak signals, emerging issues that indicate a potential future that is coming our way. And that again is empowering, because it can help us look for the things that are good, that are different, that help us live sustainably, that help just and equitable development happen. And we can think of ways of growing them into the further future where they become dominant. So that's one way to use this Three Horizons framework. And in the notes that go along with this course, there'll be some references about where to find some reading and some really nice resources about this very specific tool. So what I'd like to do now is just end off with a quote by a chap called Noah Rayford, who is doing a lot of futures work in the Middle East now. And he says futures work is really about any kind of accurate prediction. It's almost always about staging a useful intervention which encourages discussion of the most challenging aspects of the present. And the best futures projects take on difficult subjects of today, cast them forward, and reflect them back into the present in order to make them more discussable. So I hope these perspectives about multiple futures have been useful, and that you can all start working with futures and bring them into the present to help change the present in order to change the future. Thank you.